Hello everyone, Stephanie Wicker here. I'm a behavior consultant in Sydney, Australia. You can find out more about me at stephaniewicker.com. And today I've been talking about tantrums and what to do when my child tantrums. Perhaps you just finished listening to my first audio where I talked about the function behind behavior, which is also the function behind tantrums, of course, because it's basically a broad label for a variety of specific behaviors that tend to come in a pattern, okay? And they serve multiple functions. And I talked a little bit about that. Now I would love to get into replacement behaviors. So where we ended in the first audio recording was teaching them a replacement once you understand the motivation behind their tantrum. Okay, so I'm going to give some examples because again, a tantrum is a very broad label, which means that it's subjective. So it could be different to anyone depending on who's talking at the time. That tantrum can represent many different behaviors. So I can't be too specific unless you give me a specific scenario. Then we can talk through it. In the meantime, let's just go over a broad way of decreasing tantrums in the future by teaching replacement behaviors. There are many avenues to support children through tantrums and to decrease the amount of times that a child needs to rely on them to get their needs met. We're going to be looking at one specific avenue. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So when you're teaching a replacement behavior, it always begins with understanding the function that is pushing the behavior forward. Why is the child reliant on a tantrum to get their needs met in the first place? Usually that's because they feel a sense of overwhelm and they don't know what else to do. They don't have another solution to their problem, so they fall back on screaming and crying because you know what? It tends to get our attention really quickly. You know, if a little boy is screaming in a restaurant, you know what happens? Everyone stops what they're doing and they look, right? Screaming is effective, probably because it's annoying, like just being honest, like no one likes to hear someone screaming. So it gets our attention. If an adult was screaming, that would certainly get my attention. So anyway, so children learn what's effective and what's not pretty quickly. So for a replacement behavior, you want to be considering what the function is behind the motivation, right? Behind that behavior. So for example, let's say that a child doesn't want to put their socks and shoes on to go to school, or their socks and shoes on to go outside. And what they usually do is whenever you say, all right, let's put our socks and shoes on, for whatever reason, he'll scream and cry and fall to the floor. That's the behavior that we don't want to see, right? We really want to decrease that behavior. We're not going to look too deep into this because I want to keep this as applicable as possible. So we'll just keep this quite simple, all right? So that's the behavior that we want to replace. What do we want to see instead? Well, one, we want to see some expressive language. We want to see the child say maybe what they're thinking. That would be great. I don't want to put my shoes on. Oh, okay. Thank you for telling me that. That was awesome using your words. Another thing that we want to see, of course, is some obedience. Now, we're going to talk about obedience separately because that's actually a whole other skill, and we're going to look at that separate. First, we're just going to look at the most basic replacement behavior of expressing their feelings, telling us what's on their mind. Instead of screaming and crying and pulling your hair out, or instead of maybe hitting their parent when they're frustrated or kicking, biting, all of those things, I would love it if the child just told me what was on their mind. I think a lot of parents would agree with this, that if he just told me that he was frustrated, then I'd know and I'd be able to cuddle him and give him a hug and say, I understand completely. So let's start with something very simple like that. And then in another audio, we'll talk about building obedience and shaping maybe some defiance and talkback behavior, because that's a separate skill. So if we want to teach a child to express their feelings and to tell us what's going on, then we want to start being more proactive and modeling the behavior that we want to see. So when we're frustrated, we want to be very quick to say, this is how I feel. This is what's going on. This is what I'm thinking. So first we can model it. That's a great way to teach. You can also introduce some really cool videos, some fun books, all those kinds of things that give your child exposure to the behavior you want to see. And then when you introduce that challenge again, the next time you say, go put your shoes on, if you think, ooh, there's a very good chance he's going to have a tantrum again, then beat him to it. Before he even has the opportunity to tantrum, work through it. Say, I don't want to put my shoes on. And then he repeats it or she repeats it after you. That was awesome. Good talking. Okay, in that case, we'll wait about a minute and then we'll put our shoes on. So you want to make sure that their expression, their explanation of their own feelings, which is quite hard to do, by the way, at their age, if this is a toddler or a 3 or 4 year old, it can be very challenging for them. So you want to make sure that that is much more effective than the screaming and the kicking. If a child screams and kicks, then most likely mom or dad or the babysitter or a preschool teacher goes, okay, never mind, forget it, we don't need to put your shoes on. So they're going to learn that's really, really effective. That really worked. So that means that when they use language instead of kicking and screaming and falling to the floor, you want to show them that that is way more effective. And not only do they not have to put their shoes on right now, but they have an entire minute to go play. You are so happy with the fact that they actually use their words instead of screaming and crying and kicking and all those other behaviors you don't want to see. Okay, so you want to teach them what's more effective. Now, remember, this is going to lead to other behaviors. Like you might start saying, oh, well, what if my child then says, I don't want to put my shoes on, and expects to not have to put his shoes on every time I tell him to put his shoes on? No problem. We will get to that. We're going to talk about building obedience, dealing with talkback, dealing with defiance. All of those things we'll discuss. Right now, we're just looking at one thing at a time, and that is decreasing the amount of tantrums that are happening. So the more language your child is using, the better. Right? We really want to be reinforcing that use of language because it's what replaces tantrums initially. And then from there, you build other skills. See, this is where it gets really exciting because behavior is like a web. It's all connected. So as you work on this skill, you can also work on 5 other things. And all of those things generalize into each other and affect one another. And that's where we get into self-soothing. So teaching a child to express their feelings is just another beautiful, beautiful recipe or ingredient, I should say, to the recipe of self-soothing, which is what we've been talking about a lot in this group because it's a very important skill for all children of all ages. So again, we'll talk about more of that stuff in another audio. For now, we're just looking at teaching a replacement and making sure that that replacement behavior is more effective than the behavior we don't want to see. All right.